The word cut through the glittering ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria Hotel at precisely 9:34 p.m. on Saturday, April 12, 1952, when 26-year-old William Billy Ives Jr., son of United States Senator Irving Ives, pointed his champagne glass at Mayme Johnson and announced to the surrounding crowd of Manhattan's social elite that he wouldn't shake hands with some Harlem gangsters whore, regardless of whose guest list she appeared on or what charity event was being celebrated. Mayme Johnson was 37 years old in April 1952, had been married to Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson for 3.5 years since their October 1948 wedding, and represented a new phenomenon in New York's complex social landscape, the respectable wife of a powerful criminal who had been invited to legitimate charitable events because her husband's influence in Harlem made him useful to politicians and businessmen who needed black community support, but preferred not to directly acknowledge their relationships with organized crime figures. This documentary explores how racial integration of elite social spaces during the early 1950s created volatile situations where white privilege collided with emerging black economic power, often resulting in public confrontations that exposed the deep racism underlying supposedly progressive social movements. While we present these events for historical understanding, we recognize that both the criminal enterprises that created Johnson's wealth and the vigilante responses to racial insults perpetuated cycles of violence and social harm. This content examines how institutional racism in 1950s America prevented legitimate recourse for discrimination, creating environments where extralegal power structures became primary mechanisms for defending dignity and demanding respect, though we acknowledge the moral complexities and social costs of these methods. Age-restricted for mature audiences studying organized crime, history, and civil rights-era struggles. The Waldorf Astoria Charity Gala was organized by the Harlem Community Development Fund, a new organization created by progressive white philanthropists and moderate black leaders to raise money for educational programs, housing improvements, and small business loans in Harlem. And the guest list reflected the uncomfortable alliance between Manhattan's old money elite, who controlled charitable funding, Harlem's emerging black middle class who needed those resources, and the criminal organizations like Johnson's that actually wielded day-to-day power in the neighborhood through control of gambling, protection rackets, and informal financial networks that provided loans legitimate banks refused to offer black entrepreneurs. Mayme had been invited specifically because her husband's approval was necessary for the development fund to operate effectively in Harlem, where residents trusted Johnson's organization far more than they trusted white philanthropists whose previous charity efforts had been characterized by paternalism, incompetence, and frequent embezzlement. Billy Ives's insult occurred during cocktail hour, when approximately 200 guests were circulating through the ballroom making introductions, discussing charitable goals, and navigating the complex social dynamics of an event that brought together people who normally occupied completely separate worlds: Wall Street bankers who wouldn't rent apartments to black tenants, Harlem educators who depended on white-controlled foundation grants, criminal operators whose illegal businesses generated more economic activity in black neighborhoods than all legitimate enterprises combined, and political figures like Senator Ives, who needed both white campaign donors and growing black voting blocs to maintain power. Billy Ives had been drinking heavily since arriving at 7:15 p.m., had made several racist comments that other guests tried to ignore, and finally approached the group surrounding Mayme with what witnesses later described as deliberate intent to provoke confrontation rather than accidental drunken blunder. Bumpy Johnson was not present at the gala because his criminal record and open association with organized crime made it impossible for him to attend legitimate charitable events without creating embarrassment for organizers who needed his cooperation but couldn't publicly acknowledge their dependence on his power. This arrangement where Mayme represented the family at social functions, while Johnson exercised authority behind the scenes, was common among New York's criminal elite during this period, creating strange situations where wives of mobsters mingled with society women at charity events while their husbands conducted a legal business that generated the wealth funding those charitable contributions. Johnson learned about the insult at approximately 9:52 p.m. when three separate people who had witnessed Billy Ives's outburst telephoned his office on 7th Avenue to report what had happened and to express outrage that Mayme had been publicly humiliated at events she attended as invited guest. The immediate aftermath of the insult was awkward silence lasting approximately 18 seconds, during which the 50 people within hearing range processed what Billy Ives had said, calculated whether they should intervene, and considered how this incident would affect the fragile social experiment the Gala represented. Mayme maintained composure that impressed everyone present, responding to Billy Ives in voice loud enough for surrounding guests to hear that she hoped he would feel better once he sobered up and that she looked forward to supporting the Development Fund's important work, regardless of ignorant behavior from people whose fathers hadn't taught them proper manners. These response, which simultaneously condemned Billy while indirectly criticizing Senator Ives's parenting, struck exactly the right tone to maximize Billy's humiliation while maintaining Mayme's dignity, and it earned immediate support from several prominent guests who moved to stand beside her in visible solidarity against the racist attack. Senator Irving Ives was not present at the gala, but learned about his son's behavior within 30 minutes, when multiple phone calls from political allies, charitable organization board members, and concerned constituents informed him that Billy had created major scandal by using racist language against prominent Harlem woman at high-profile charity event. The political implications were immediately obvious to Ives, who had built his Senate career partly on reputation as moderate Republican, who supported anti-discrimination legislation and cultivated relationships with black voters, and whose son's public racism threatened to destroy carefully constructed image as progressive on racial issues. Ives telephoned the Waldorf Astoria at 10:27 p.m., attempting to speak with Mayme to personally apologize, but she had already departed after deciding that remaining at event where she'd been insulty would suggest she accepted the treatment or felt obligated to minimize the incident for sake of white guests' comfort. If you've ever witnessed privileged people discover that their social position cannot shield them from consequences when they attack someone connected to different but equally powerful networks, subscribe and comment about moments when arrogance meets reality. Because what Bumpy Johnson orchestrated over the next 5 days would demonstrate that political power in 1950s. New York depended on complex alliances that senators' sons could destroy through casual racism, but that organized crime figures could exploit through systematic application of economic and social pressure. The strategic challenge Johnson faced was that Billy Ives's insult to Mayme represented attack on Johnson's own status and dignity rather than just personal offense against his wife, creating a situation where failing to respond would signal weakness that rivals could exploit, while responding to violently might alienate legitimate business contacts and political allies whose support Johnson needed to maintain his position as Harlem's dominant power broker. The solution Johnson developed combined economic warfare, social ostracism, and exposure of compromising information in ways that would destroy Billy Ives's reputation and career prospects without direct violence that could be traced to Johnson's organization or that would trigger law enforcement response that might disrupt Johnson's larger operations. Samuel Chun, who managed Johnson's intelligence network, began gathering information about Billy Ives within hours of the insult, deploying the same investigative resources Johnson used to monitor rival criminal organizations, corrupt police officers, and political figures whose decisions affected Harlem's economic interests. The initial research revealed that Billy Ives was a mediocre Columbia Law School student with poor academic performance, history of drunken behavior at Manhattan nightclubs, and reputation among classmates as entitled brat who relied on father's position rather than developing own abilities or work ethic. This baseline intelligence suggested vulnerability to strategic pressure because Billy lacked independent accomplishments or personal relationships strong enough to survive systematic attack on his reputation and prospects. More detailed investigation over following hours uncovered information far more damaging than Johnson initially expected. Billy Ives had accumulated approximately $47,000 in gambling debts to 3 different bookmaking operations in Manhattan, had written bad checks totaling $11,300 to cover previous losses, and was being threatened with legal action by creditors who had initially extended credit based on assumption that Senator's son would eventually pay. The gambling debts alone represented scandal that could destroy Senator Ives's political career if publicized. Since the senator had supported legislation against organized gambling while his son patronized illegal bookmakers, and the bad checks constituted fraud that could result in criminal charges if creditors chose to prosecute, rather than continuing to seek payment through civil remedies. Additional intelligence revealed that Billy Ives was involved in relationship with married woman whose husband was prominent Democratic Party donor, and whose public exposure would create political problems for both Senator Ives and the woman's husband, creating multiple parties with interest in preventing scandal while simultaneously creating leverage Johnson could exploit by threatening disclosure. The relationship had been relatively discreet until Johnson's investigators began documenting meetings at Midtown hotels, photographing Billy and the woman entering and exiting establishments at suspicious times, and collecting testimony from hotel staff who could confirm the affair if called to testify in divorce proceedings or political investigations. The systemic failures that created this volatile situation extended beyond individual racism to encompass broader patterns in American society, where elite white families could raise children in environments of complete privilege without accountability, where political positions provided protection from consequences that ordinary people faced for similar behavior, and where institutional racism meant that Black Americans couldn't appeal to legal authorities or social norms for redress when insulted or attacked by members of white establishment. This structural inequality explains, though doesn't justify, why Johnson responded through extra-legal channels rather than pursuing complaints through proper social or legal mechanisms that would have been ineffective given the racial dynamics of the period. Have you ever seen someone discover that privilege provides protection only until they attack someone with access to different forms of power? Comment whether you'd prioritize forgiveness or accountability. Hit LIKE if you recognize how systematic research into opponents' vulnerabilities can create leverage more effective than direct confrontation. Johnson's operational plan involved 3 simultaneous campaigns designed to destroy Billy Ives's reputation, career prospects, and social standing while demonstrating to Senator Ives that his political position couldn't protect his family from consequences when they attacked Johnson's. First campaign targeted Billy's gambling debts by purchasing the obligations from bookmakers at substantial discount, approximately $31,000 paid for $47,000 in debts, then demanding immediate, full payment while threatening criminal prosecution for bad checks and fraud if Billy didn't settle accounts within 72 hours. Second campaign involved delivering evidence of Billy's affair to the married woman's husband through anonymous letter that included photographs, hotel records, and detailed timeline of the relationship, creating personal crises that would force Billy to deal with enraged husband and potential divorce scandal simultaneously with financial problems. Third campaign focused on destroying Billy's law school career and future employment prospects through coordinated exposure of his academic dishonesty, mediocre performance, and racist behavior to Columbia administrators, potential employers, and legal community leaders who would determine whether Billy could practice law in New York. The gambling debt campaign executed Monday, April 14th, when Johnson's financial manager, Bernard Klein, visited each bookmaker holding Billy's obligations and offered to purchase debts for approximately 65 cents on dollar, explaining that Klein represented investors interested in acquiring distressed receivables and planned to pursue aggressive collection, including potential criminal charges for fraud. The bookmakers accepted immediately because they had been struggling to collect from Billy for 8 months and recognized that selling debts to third party allowed them to recover substantial portion of money owed while eliminating headache of dealing with Senator's son, who alternated between promises to pay, threats involving his father's political connections, and complete avoidance of bookmakers who tried to contact him. Klein took ownership of all 3 debt portfolios by end of business Monday, then sent certified letters to Billy's apartment demanding payment of full $47,000 plus accumulated interest by Thursday, April 17th, or face criminal prosecution for check fraud. The affair exposure campaign executed Tuesday, April 15th, when anonymous package arrived at the married woman's husband's office containing photographs showing Billy and the woman entering hotel room, hotel registration records with fake names that handwriting analysis could link to Billy, and detailed timeline of meetings over previous 7 months. The husband, corporate attorney named Robert Harrison, immediately confronted his wife, discovered the affair had been ongoing, and retained divorce attorney by end of the day, creating social scandal that would eventually become public despite both parties' desire for discretion once divorce proceedings began and court documents became accessible to reporters covering New York society news. The scandal would damage both Harrison's and Senator Ives's political and social standing while creating intense pressure on Billy from multiple directions simultaneously. The academic and professional destruction campaign executed Wednesday, April 16th, when anonymous letters arrived at Columbia Law School dean's office, several major Manhattan law firms, a New York State Bar Association containing documented evidence of Billy's academic dishonesty, including plagiarism in 2 major papers and cheating on 3 examinations. The evidence had been obtained through Johnson's Columbia contacts, including students who had witnessed Billy's cheating but hadn't reported it, because they feared retaliation from Senator's son, professors who suspected academic dishonesty but lacked proof sufficient for disciplinary action, and staff who had access to examination records showing suspicious similarities between Billy's answers and those of better students sitting nearby. These evidence, combined with Billy's poor academic record and the recent public racism at Waldorf Astoria Gala that multiple Columbia administrators had heard about, created consensus that Billy represented liability to institution's reputation and should be expelled or pressured to withdraw before his behavior created further embarrassment. Billy Ives's world collapsed over 72 hours starting Monday morning when he received Bernard Klein's letter demanding payment of gambling debts he'd assumed were untraceable to him personally, and continuing through Wednesday when Columbia Law School dean summoned him to meeting about academic dishonesty allegations that Billy had no idea anyone possessed evidence to support. The simultaneous pressures financial crisis requiring $47,000 he didn't have, divorce scandal threatening to expose affair and create political problems for his father, an academic investigation threatening to end his legal career before it started to produce psychological breakdown that left Billy unable to function effectively or develop coherent response to any single crisis, much less coordinate defense against all 3 attacks occurring simultaneously. Senator Ives learned about his son's gambling debts Tuesday evening when Billy finally admitted the financial problems and begged his father to intervene with creditors who are demanding immediate payment. The senator's initial reaction was fury that Billy had accumulated such massive debts while living on family money, but the political calculation quickly became primary concern. Paying Billy's gambling debts would appear on financial disclosure forms that senators were required to file, creating public record that journalists could use to highlight hypocrisy of senator who supported anti-gambling legislation while bailing out son who patronized illegal bookmakers. The alternative, refusing to pay and allowing creditors to pursue criminal charges, would create even worse political optics, since it would appear the senator was abandoning his son to consequences of actions that powerful families normally shielded their children from facing. The senator attempted to negotiate with Klein on Wednesday, hoping to arrange confidential settlement that would avoid public disclosure of Billy's debts or the senator's payment. But Klein refused all proposed terms and insisted on either full immediate payment or criminal prosecution for check fraud. This hardline reflected Johnson's strategic calculation that Senator Ives needed to understand that Billy's attack on Mayme had triggered response that the senator's political position couldn't contain through normal methods of influence and negotiation. The message was clear. Johnson possessed power independent of political establishment, could strike at elite families through their vulnerable members, and wouldn't be deterred by considerations of political harmony or mutual interest in avoiding publicity that the senator might hope would constrain Johnson's retaliation. The affair's scandal became public Thursday, April 17th, when Harrison's divorce attorney filed papers in Manhattan court system. And by Friday morning, 3 different newspapers had published items in their society pages, noting that prominent attorney was divorcing his wife amid allegations of infidelity with unnamed law student, whose father held high political office. The stories didn't initially name Billy Ives, but contained enough identifying details that anyone familiar with New York society and politics could deduce the parties involved. And by Saturday, the Amsterdam News published full account naming Billy explicitly and noting his recent racist behavior at Waldorf Astoria Gala as evidence a pattern of entitled misconduct that elite white families typically concealed through money and influence. Columbia Law School administration pressured Billy to withdraw voluntarily rather than face formal expulsion proceedings that would create permanent record of academic dishonesty, and Billy agreed Thursday afternoon to leave the law school effective immediately, ending his legal career before it began and eliminating his planned professional path that had been based entirely on assumption that his father's position would compensate for his mediocre abilities and poor work ethic. The withdrawal notice submitted to Columbia cited personal reasons without mentioning the academic dishonesty allegations. But the timing immediately following the gambling, debt, and affair scandals made clear to everyone in New York's legal community that Billy had been forced out for serious misconduct that the school preferred to handle quietly, rather than through public disciplinary proceedings. If you were as methodical as Bumpy Johnson in dismantling an opponent's entire life through coordinated pressure on multiple fronts, hit like and subscribe because the aftermath demonstrated how social and economic destruction could achieve more complete victory than physical violence while establishing deterrent messages about consequences of attacking powerful people's families. Senator Ives paid Billy's gambling debts on Friday, April 18th, after calculating that the political damage from public criminal prosecution would exceed the damage from financial disclosure showing he'd bailed out his son, and the payment immediately appeared in required Senate financial forms, creating permanent record of the scandal that political opponents could reference in future campaigns. The senator also issued public statement acknowledging Billy's serious errors in judgment, apologizing for his son's racist behavior at the charity gala, and announcing Billy would be taking time away from his studies to address personal issues, which everyone understood meant Billy had been expelled from Columbia and sent away from New York to avoid further scandal. Johnson never publicly acknowledged his role in Billy's destruction, maintaining plausible deniability that allowed him to avoid direct confrontation with Senator Ives, while ensuring that everyone in New York's political and criminal communities understood exactly what had happened and why. The message was clear. Attacking Johnson's family triggered systematic response that would destroy the attacker's life regardless of their political connections, wealth, or social position, and this message resonated throughout networks of power that governed New York in ways that prevented future incidents because no one wanted to become object lesson in consequences of underestimating Johnson's capabilities or willingness to retaliate against those who showed disrespect. The broader implications of Billy Ives's downfall extended beyond immediate punishment to reshape calculations that wealthy white families made about how their children could behave toward black Americans who possessed independent power bases. The incident demonstrated that emerging black economic and political power in neighborhoods like Harlem created new dynamics where traditional racial hierarchies no longer functioned as reliable predictors of who could attack whom with impunity, and where elite white families discovered that their social position provided protection only within traditional power structures that didn't extend to underground networks of criminal organizations, intelligence gathering, and economic leverage. That figures like Johnson had built specifically to operate outside channels where white privilege normally prevailed. The long-term consequences for Billy Ives included permanent exile from New York social and professional circles that might have overlooked single scandal but couldn't accept combination of racist behavior, gambling addiction, sexual infidelity, academic dishonesty, and public humiliation that marked him as liability to anyone who associated with him. He moved to California in late April 1952 and eventually found work in his uncle's real estate business. living anonymous middle-class existence, far removed from the elite Manhattan society he'd been raised to dominate, and serving as cautionary tale about how quickly privilege could evaporate when behavior triggered responses from people with resources to strike back through methods that traditional power structures couldn't prevent or contain. Senator Ives's political career survived the scandal, though it created vulnerabilities that opponents exploited in future campaigns. And the senator became notably more careful about his relationships with black political leaders and community organizations, recognizing that his son's behavior had demonstrated the costs of allowing racial prejudice to undermine alliances that were becoming increasingly important in New York politics as black voting power grew and racial attitudes slowly evolved toward greater acknowledgement of equality, even while deep racism remained endemic throughout American society. The senator never again attended events where he might encounter Johnson or his associates, maintaining distance that allowed both men to avoid confrontations that would have been politically damaging to the senator and operationally disruptive to Johnson's business interests. Subscribe for more stories about how economic power and strategic intelligence can achieve victories that physical force cannot, and about the complex dynamics of race, class, and power in 1950s America, when traditional hierarchies began encountering challenges from newly empowered communities that refused to accept subordinate positions. Tell us whether you've seen other examples of how systematic research and coordinated pressure can destroy opponents more thoroughly than direct violence. Mayme Johnson never publicly discussed the incident or its aftermath, maintaining the dignity that had impressed witnesses at the Gala and that represented her own form of power in marriage with man whose criminal career required that she navigate complex social situations involving both legitimate society and underground networks. Her handling of Billy Ives's initial insult responding with grace that highlighted his boorishness while maintaining her own moral authority set tone for Johnson's subsequent retaliation by demonstrating that the Johnson family deserved respect and that attacks on them came from people whose character deficiencies made them unworthy of the positions they occupied. This performance of respectability and dignity served important strategic purposes in Johnson's larger project of establishing black criminal organizations as legitimate powers entitled to the same courtesies and considerations that white mobsters received from political establishment. The story of how Senator Ives's son called Mayme Johnson a whore at charity gala and suffered systematic destruction of his reputation, career, and social standing illustrates the complex power dynamics of 1950s New York, where traditional racial hierarchies were beginning to encounter challenges from black economic and political power that operated through different channels than white establishment, but proved equally capable of defending its interests and punishing those who showed disrespect. We present this history not to glorify criminal power or extra-legal retaliation, but to document how systemic racism created situations where black Americans couldn't appeal to legitimate institutions for protection or justice when attacked by white elites, leaving them dependent on underground power structures that combined criminal enterprise with community protection in ways that challenged simple moral judgments about right and wrong, legal and illegal, oppression and resistance. The broader lesson remains that societies where legal institutions fail to provide equal protection and equal justice create environments where extra-legal power structures emerge to fill those voids, and where the resulting conflicts between different forms of power produce outcomes that reflect raw leverage and strategic capabilities rather than abstract principles of fairness or legitimacy. The incident between Billy Ives and Mayme Johnson represented microcosm of larger American struggles during the civil rights era, when black communities were asserting their right to dignity and respect through whatever means they could access, while white establishment was discovering that traditional privileges couldn't protect them from consequences. When they attacked people who had developed independent sources of power and were willing to use those capabilities to defend themselves and their families from racist assaults that legal systems refused to prevent or punish.